The storm had been brewing for 3 days, turning the Minnesota sky into a canvas of angry grays and blacks that seemed to mirror the turmoil brewing in Paul Bunyan's chest. He stood at the edge of his property, watching the wind bend century-old pines like they were mere saplings, his massive frame casting a shadow that could eclipse a small barn. At nearly 12 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of mountains, Paul had always been more legend than man, more myth than father. But today, as he watched his 8-year-old son Tommy chase their chickens back toward the coop, he felt smaller than he ever had in his entire extraordinary life. Eleanor called from the cabin's porch, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Tommy, get inside now!" But the boy was determined, his small legs pumping as he herded the last stubborn hen toward safety. Paul could see it happening before anyone else could, the way the ancient oak near the chicken coop swayed with a different rhythm than the other trees, the deep groaning sound that meant its roots were losing their grip on the rain-soaked earth. His son was directly in its path, oblivious to the danger, focused only on saving the family's livestock with the kind of pure-hearted determination that made Paul's chest ache with pride and terror. Without thinking, Paul moved. When a man of his size and strength moves with urgency, the earth itself takes notice. His footsteps created small earthquakes, sending vibrations through the ground that spooked the horses and made the cabin windows rattle in their frames. He reached Tommy just as the oak began its final, thunderous descent, wrapping his enormous arms around his son to shield him from the crushing weight. But Paul's strength had always been his curse as much as his gift. In his desperate attempt to protect Tommy, his grip tightened beyond human limits. The boy's ribs bent under the pressure, and a sharp cry of pain cut through the storm's roar. The tree crashed where Tommy had been standing moments before, its branches creating a cage of wood and leaves around father and son. But it was Paul's strength, not the falling oak, that had hurt his child. Tommy lay unconscious in his father's arms, his small chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. Paul's hands, capable of felling entire forests, trembled as they hovered over his son's fragile form, afraid to touch him again, afraid of causing more damage. Eleanor reached them first, her medical training as the camp's only nurse taking over as she assessed Tommy's injuries with quick, efficient movements. "Broken ribs," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "He'll live, but Paul..." She looked up at her husband, seeing not the legendary giant who could redirect rivers and level mountains, but a broken man who had just learned that his greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. "You nearly crushed him." The words hit Paul harder than any falling tree ever could. He had spent his entire life using his strength to protect, to provide, to conquer nature itself for the good of his family and community. But in that moment, surrounded by the debris of the storm and holding his injured son, Paul Bunyan realized that all his legendary power meant nothing if he couldn't control it around the people he loved most. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of his certainty about who he was supposed to be. In trying to save his son, he had nearly destroyed him, and that knowledge settled in his chest like a stone that would never dissolve. 3 weeks had passed since the storm, and Tommy's ribs were healing, but the distance between father and son had only grown wider. Paul watched from the kitchen window as his boy played in the yard, moving more carefully now, one hand unconsciously protecting his left side, where the bruises were finally fading from purple to yellow. Eleanor had assured him repeatedly that children heal quickly, that Tommy would be fine, but Paul could see something else in his son's eyes now, a wariness that hadn't been there before, a quick glance toward the tree line whenever Paul emerged from the cabin, as if calculating escape routes. The realization that his own child was afraid of him ate at Paul like acid. He'd become a stranger in his own home, tiptoeing around his family as if he were made of dynamite instead of flesh and bone. Every morning, he made his coffee in silence, careful not to let his massive hands make too much noise with the tin cups. Every evening, he sat in his oversized chair by the fire, watching Eleanor read stories to Tommy and 5-year-old Lucy, acutely aware of how they all relaxed when he wasn't participating. He was the monster in their fairy tale, the giant who lived in the same house but belonged to a different world entirely. It was on a Tuesday morning, when the autumn mist hung low over the forest like a shroud, that Paul made his decision. He had been offered a job logging the distant timber claims near the Canadian border, dangerous work that would take him away for months at a time. Previously, he had turned down such offers because they meant leaving his family, but now that seemed like exactly what they needed. Eleanor was kneading bread when he approached her, his footsteps deliberately heavy to announce his presence so he wouldn't startle her. "I'm taking the Mackenzie contract," he said without preamble, his voice barely above a whisper, even though it still seemed to fill the entire kitchen. Eleanor's hands stilled in the dough, and for a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire in the stove. When she finally looked up at him, her green eyes held a mixture of understanding and profound sadness that made his chest tighten. She had married a legend, but she had fallen in love with the man underneath, and now that man was disappearing into the wilderness, convinced he was protecting his family by abandoning them. "How long?" she asked, her voice steady in the way that meant she was fighting back tears. Paul couldn't meet her eyes as he answered. "However long it takes to clear the northern timber. Could be 6 months, maybe more." The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unusual quiet, and Paul saw the boy's expression shift from curiosity to understanding, to something that looked almost like relief. That look, more than anything else, confirmed Paul's decision. He packed that afternoon, loading his few belongings into a rucksack that looked comically small against his massive frame. Babe, his faithful blue ox, seemed to sense the gravity of the situation and stood unusually still as Paul secured their traveling gear. Eleanor helped him pack food for the journey, her movements efficient but distant, as if she were already practicing life without him. The children watched from the porch, Tommy holding Lucy's hand in a protective gesture that was heartbreakingly familiar. It was exactly how Paul himself had held Eleanor during their early courting days, when he was still learning to control his strength around something precious. As Paul prepared to leave, he knelt down to say goodbye to his children, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. Tommy stepped back slightly when Paul reached toward him, an unconscious movement that felt like a knife to the heart. Lucy hid behind her brother, peeking out with wide eyes that held more curiosity than fear, but still kept her small body safely behind the barrier of Tommy's protection. Paul's hands fell to his sides, and he stood without touching either of them. "I'll send money," he promised Eleanor, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't name. "And I'll write when I can." She nodded, understanding that this wasn't just a temporary job, but a kind of exile, a penance he was imposing on himself for the crime of loving his family too dangerously. As Paul and Babe disappeared into the forest that had been his domain for so many years, Eleanor stood on the porch with her children, all 3 of them watching the legendary giant become just another shadow among the trees, leaving them to learn how to be a family without the very man who had created them. The first month without Paul was the hardest, not because of the physical work, though splitting firewood with an axe designed for normal-sized hands proved nearly impossible, but because of the silence that filled the spaces where his presence used to be. Eleanor had always been the heart of their home, but now she discovered she had to become its backbone as well. At 5 feet 4 inches tall, she looked impossibly small in the cabin that Paul had built to accommodate his massive frame, but she moved through it with a quiet determination that impressed even herself. Tommy had grown protective in ways that broke Eleanor's heart and filled her with pride simultaneously. He took over the morning chores without being asked, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs with the same methodical care his father had once shown. But Eleanor noticed how he avoided the spot where the oak tree had fallen, how he would take the long way around the chicken coop rather than walk directly past the place where his father's strength had nearly crushed him. The boy was healing physically, but emotionally, he was learning to navigate a world where the person who was supposed to protect him had become the source of his greatest fear. Lucy, at 5 years old, dealt with her father's absence differently. She had taken to carrying around one of Paul's old flannel shirts, dragging it behind her like a security blanket that smelled of pine sap and wood smoke. Eleanor would find her daughter curled up in Paul's oversized chair, swimming in the fabric of his shirt, talking to herself in whispered conversations that seemed to be directed at someone who wasn't there. When Eleanor asked who she was talking to, Lucy would look up with those wide, serious eyes and say simply, "Papa Giant," as if her father had become a mythical figure rather than a man who had once lived in their home. The money Paul sent helped with supplies, but it was the letters that truly sustained Eleanor. They arrived irregularly, carried by traders and loggers who passed through the northern camps, and they revealed a side of Paul that his physical presence had somehow obscured. On paper, stripped of his intimidating size and legendary strength, he was simply a man missing his family desperately. He wrote about the northern lights dancing across the frozen lakes, about Babe's stubborn refusal to work when the temperature dropped below zero, about the way the silence of the deep woods made him think of Eleanor's laughter and how much he missed the sound of it. Eleanor began reading these letters aloud to the children during their evening routine, editing out the parts where Paul's loneliness bled through too clearly, focusing instead on his descriptions of the wilderness and his gentle inquiries about their daily lives. Slowly, she watched her children's perception of their father begin to shift. Through his letters, Paul became less the dangerous giant who had hurt Tommy, and more the man who worried about whether Lucy was remembering to wear her mittens, who wanted to know if Tommy was still practicing his reading every night. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it challenges that Eleanor had never faced alone. The cabin's massive fireplace, designed to heat a home for a giant's family, consumed firewood at an alarming rate, and Eleanor found herself making difficult choices about fuel and food that Paul's presence would have rendered unnecessary. But she also discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. When a pack of wolves came too close to the cabin, drawn by the scent of their livestock, Eleanor stood on the porch with Paul's hunting rifle and faced them down with a courage that surprised even her. The wolves retreated, perhaps sensing that this small woman carried within her something far more dangerous than any weapon. The children watched their mother navigate these challenges with growing admiration. Tommy began to see strength as something more complex than pure physical power, while Lucy started to understand that protection could come in forms other than her father's overwhelming presence. Eleanor was teaching them, through her example, that love sometimes meant standing firm rather than sheltering, that true strength could be measured not in trees felled or rivers diverted, but in the quiet persistence of caring for others, day after day, season after season. As Christmas approached, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. She sat down at the small writing desk Paul had carved for her years earlier and began composing a letter that would either bring her husband home or finally set him free to become the legend the world expected him to be. Her hands were steady as she wrote, because she had learned something important during those months alone. Sometimes the greatest act of love is demanding that the people you care about face the very thing they're running from. The northern wilderness had become Paul's confessional, a place where he could rage and grieve without fear of hurting anyone else. The logging camp was populated by men who spoke little and understood even less about the internal war being fought by their legendary foreman. They saw only what they had always seen: Paul Bunyan, the giant who could clear a hillside of timber in a single day, who could redirect streams with his bare hands, and whose blue ox could haul loads that would have broken a dozen regular teams. What they couldn't see was how he lay awake in his oversized bunk, staring at the cabin ceiling and counting the days since he had held his children. Eleanor's letters arrived like drops of water to a man dying of thirst, but they also brought a pain that was almost unbearable. Her words painted pictures of a family learning to function without him, of Tommy growing braver and more responsible, of Lucy taking her first steps toward reading by sounding out words in the books Eleanor read to them each night. Paul could see between the lines that his absence was healing his family in ways his presence never had, and that knowledge sat in his chest like a stone that grew heavier with each passing day. The work became his escape and his prison simultaneously. Paul threw himself into logging with a fury that impressed even the hardened woodsmen around him. He worked 18-hour days, felling trees with an aggression that spoke of deeper frustrations. Each swing of his massive axe an attempt to cut away the part of himself that had proven too dangerous for fatherhood. Babe watched his master with growing concern, the intelligent ox sensing that something fundamental had shifted in their partnership. Where once Paul had worked with joy and purpose, now he labored with the desperate energy of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. The other loggers began to give Paul a wide berth, not out of fear, but out of recognition that their foreman was fighting a battle they couldn't understand. They had all left families behind for the promise of steady work and good pay, but none of them carried the burden of believing their very existence was a threat to the people they loved most. Paul's legendary strength, which had always been a source of pride and identity, had become a curse that separated him from everything that mattered. It was during the longest night of winter, when the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, that Paul received Eleanor's Christmas letter. He read it alone in the light of the camp's central fire, the other men having retreated to their bunks hours earlier. Her words were careful and loving, describing the children's excitement about the holiday, their plans for a small celebration, their hope that Papa Giant would find his way home soon. But it was the postscript that undid him completely. Tommy asks about you every night, and Lucy has been practicing a song to sing for you when you return. They miss their father, Paul, not the legend. Just the man who used to read them stories and teach them about the forest. That man doesn't have to be perfect to be loved. The letter fell from Paul's massive hands as something broke open inside his chest. He had been running from his family to protect them, but Eleanor's words forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding. His children didn't need him to be the mythical Paul Bunyan. They needed him to be their father, flaws and dangerous strength included. The realization that he had been punishing his family for his own fears rather than protecting them from his nature hit him like a physical blow. Paul stood and walked out into the winter night, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he looked up at the dancing lights in the sky. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to truly feel the depth of his longing for home. The aurora seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat, and in that moment, Paul understood that running away had never been about protecting his family. It had been about protecting himself from the possibility of failing them again. But Eleanor's letter had shown him something crucial. Love wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present, even when presence came with risks. The northern lights flickered and danced above him as Paul Bunyan made a decision that would change everything. It was time to stop running from the man his family needed him to be. Paul had been preparing for his journey home when the telegram arrived, carried by a breathless rider who had pushed his horse through a blizzard to reach the remote logging camp. The words were few, but devastating. Lucy gravely ill. Fever won't break. Come home immediately. Eleanor. The paper trembled in Paul's massive hands as he read the message 3 times, each reading making the reality more terrifying. His little girl, the one who called him Papa Giant and carried his old shirts like treasures, was fighting for her life while he was hundreds of miles away, playing the role of exile and martyr. Within an hour, Paul had abandoned the logging operation and set out across the frozen wilderness with Babe, pushing through a winter storm that would have turned back any normal man. The journey that had taken him 3 days in autumn now became a desperate race against time and weather. Trees that would normally take minutes to navigate around, Paul simply plowed through, leaving a path of destruction in his wake that looked like a tornado had swept through the forest. Babe struggled to keep up with his master's frantic pace, the loyal ox understanding that something terrible was driving them toward home. The storm seemed to sense Paul's urgency and fought him every step of the way. Winds that could have knocked down buildings howled around him, but Paul pressed forward with the single-minded determination of a father who might be too late. Snow fell in sheets so thick he could barely see Babe's massive form just ahead of him, but Paul navigated by instinct and desperation, following a path that existed more in his heart than in any recognizable landmarks. Every mile felt like an eternity. Every hour brought new fears about what he might find when he finally reached home. When Paul finally emerged from the forest and saw the warm glow of lamplight in the cabin windows, he felt a relief so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. But that relief was immediately replaced by terror as he approached the cabin and heard the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life: Lucy's labored breathing, punctuated by the weak coughs of a child fighting pneumonia. Through the frosted window, he could see Eleanor, sitting beside their daughter's bed, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear, holding Lucy's small hand between both of hers as if she could transfer her own strength to her dying child. Paul stood frozen outside his own home, suddenly aware that his legendary strength meant nothing in the face of his daughter's illness. He could fell forests and redirect rivers, but he couldn't fight the fever that was consuming Lucy's small body. For a moment, the old fear returned. What if his presence somehow made things worse? What if his touch, which had already hurt Tommy once, was too rough for a child so fragile she seemed to be fading before his eyes? But then Lucy's voice, weak but unmistakably hers, drifted through the window. "Mama, when is Papa Giant coming home? I want to sing him my song." That small, brave voice shattered every wall Paul had built around his heart. He couldn't save his daughter with his strength, but he could love her with his presence, and maybe that would be enough. Paul opened the cabin door as gently as his massive frame would allow, and Eleanor looked up with eyes that showed relief, exhaustion, and something that looked like forgiveness all at once. Tommy appeared from the kitchen, no longer the fearful boy who had hidden from his father's approach, but a young man who understood that some moments transcended fear. "She's been asking for you," Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse from days of vigil. "The doctor from town couldn't make it through the storm, but maybe—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Paul understood. Maybe love would be medicine enough. Maybe being present was more powerful than being perfect. Paul approached his daughter's bedside with steps so careful they barely disturbed the floorboards, and when Lucy's fever-bright eyes opened and focused on his face, her smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Papa Giant," she whispered, her small hand reaching toward him. "I knew you'd come back." And for the first time in months, Paul reached out without fear and took his daughter's hand in his, discovering that gentleness wasn't about strength. It was about love, learning to express itself in whispers instead of roars. For 3 days and nights, Paul didn't leave Lucy's bedside. The man who had once worked 18-hour days without rest now dedicated every ounce of his legendary endurance to the delicate task of nursing his daughter back to health. He learned to move with a precision that had nothing to do with felling trees and everything to do with love, expressing itself through the smallest gestures. When Lucy's fever spiked, Paul's massive hands became instruments of tenderness, cooling her forehead with damp cloths applied with the gentleness of butterfly wings. When she shivered, he learned to adjust her blankets with touches so light they barely disturbed the fabric. Eleanor watched in amazement as her husband transformed before her eyes. The Paul who had fled in fear of his own strength was discovering that true power lay not in what he could destroy, but in what he could nurture. Tommy, initially wary of his father's return, found himself drawn to observe this new version of Papa Giant, a man who could sing lullabies in a voice so soft it was barely audible, who could hold Lucy's tiny hand for hours without moving, who had somehow learned to make his enormous presence feel safe rather than overwhelming. On the fourth morning, Lucy's fever finally broke. Paul felt the change before anyone else, his hand resting lightly on her forehead, detecting the subtle shift from burning heat to normal warmth. When her eyes opened, clear and bright instead of glazed with sickness, she looked up at her father and smiled. "Papa Giant," she whispered, her voice still weak but unmistakably stronger. "Will you stay home now?" The question held all the vulnerability of a child who had learned that the people she loved could disappear without warning, and Paul's answer came from a place deeper than fear or legend. "Yes, little star," he said, using the pet name he had given her as a baby, but had been too afraid to speak in months. "Papa Giant is home to stay." Lucy's smile could have powered the entire logging camp, and when she asked if he would like to hear the song she had been practicing, Paul felt his chest fill with an emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm him. Her song was simple, a melody Eleanor had taught her about a giant who lived in the forest and loved his family more than all the trees in the world. As Lucy sang in her sweet, recovering voice, Paul realized that his children had never seen him as a monster. That perception had been his own creation, born from guilt and fear rather than reality. Tommy approached the bed hesitantly, and Paul could see the boy wrestling with his own complicated feelings about his father's return. The memory of broken ribs and overwhelming strength was still there, but it was being slowly overshadowed by the evidence of this gentler version of his father. When Paul extended his hand toward Tommy, palm up in invitation rather than demand, the boy took a tentative step forward. "I missed you, Papa," Tommy said quietly, and those 4 words carried the weight of forgiveness that Paul hadn't dared hope for. The reunion was interrupted by the sound of horses and shouting voices outside. Through the window, Paul could see a group of men from the Mackenzie Logging Company approaching the cabin, their faces grim with purpose. Eleanor's expression darkened as she recognized their leader, James Mackenzie himself, a man known for his ruthless business practices and his particular hatred of Paul's reputation for protecting forest land that companies wanted to exploit. Paul stood slowly, his protective instincts flaring, but instead of the rage that had once characterized his confrontations, he felt a different kind of strength flowing through him. "Stay with the children," he told Eleanor, his voice calm but carrying an authority that had nothing to do with his size. As Paul stepped outside to face Mackenzie and his men, he carried with him everything he had learned during Lucy's illness. True strength wasn't about intimidation or destruction. It was about protecting what mattered most with wisdom rather than force. The confrontation that followed would test not Paul's legendary physical power, but his newfound understanding that the greatest victories are won not by those who can break their enemies, but by those who can hold their loved ones gently while standing unshakably firm against any threat to their family's peace. The man who emerged from that cabin was still Paul Bunyan, but he was no longer just a legend. He was a father who had finally learned that his most important job had never been moving mountains, but moving carefully through the sacred space of his children's trust.